I could feel my ankle throbbing with every heartbeat. The swelling so bad I could barely slip on my shoe, and my head felt light like the room might tilt any second. So I asked for the smallest thing, just a ride to the clinic. 12 minutes down the road. And he didn't even look up from his phone when he said, "I'm not your chauffeur, Mom." The words falling so flat and cold they seemed to push the air out of the room. And in that instant, all the years of walking him through pouring rain, holding his hand so he wouldn't slip, carrying bags heavier than I should have, all of it flashed through me. And I knew something in me had just closed for good. Thank you for watching and sitting with me through this. It means more than you know. And before I go on, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I like to picture the places these stories reach. Because sometimes it feels like the only people who truly listen are the ones far away. After he said those words to me, I just sat there for a moment, quiet, feeling the weight of them settle in my chest like a stone. And I kept thinking about all the mornings when the rain would soak through my coat, but I'd keep walking beside him, making sure he got to where he needed to be. Back then, I never once thought about the discomfort. I just thought about keeping him safe and on time. Yet here I was, years later, asking for a simple ride because my ankle was swollen and my head felt unsteady, and it was met with nothing but dismissal. The house around me felt colder after that, not because the temperature had changed, but because something between us had. And no matter how I tried to shake it off, I couldn't ignore the truth that had just shown itself so plainly. I sat there in that chair for a long while after he walked out of the room, listening to the faint sound of the television in the distance and the hum of the refrigerator. And I thought about the years when life was nothing but work, sacrifice, and hope. That all the effort I poured into raising him would mean something. I remembered how I used to rise before the sun, slipping my hands into cold dishwater to wash last night's dishes before making breakfast, packing a lunch with whatever I could stretch from the pantry, and then walking him to school no matter the weather. My shoes sometimes soaked through before we even got halfway. There were days my own body ached, days when I could feel a fever creeping in. But I still pushed forward, because in my heart I believed that showing up for him every single day was the way to teach him love and responsibility. I thought about the nights I stayed up sewing loose buttons on his shirts so he wouldn't be embarrassed. The afternoons spent at the kitchen table, helping him with schoolwork, even when my eyes were heavy with exhaustion. And the way I would quietly go without things I needed so that he could have something he wanted. All those memories came rushing in as I sat there, feeling the deep ache in my ankle, and the heaviness of his words played over in my mind. I realized that somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing me as the person who had stood by him through everything, and had started seeing me as someone whose needs were inconvenient, someone who could be brushed aside without a second thought. That hurt in a way I can't quite put into words, because it wasn't just about the ride. It was about the years of love, the quiet sacrifices, and the moments of care that seemed to have vanished from his memory. I looked around that room, at the familiar walls and the things I had collected over the years, and it no longer felt like home. It felt like a place I was only occupying until I was told I was in the way. I remember sitting there in that silence, my hands resting in my lap, fingers twisting together without me even realizing it. And I kept staring at the faint scuff marks on the floor, the ones I had never gotten around to polishing, thinking about how those marks had been made by his shoes when he used to run into the kitchen after school, tossing his bag on the chair and asking what was for dinner. Those scuffs used to make me smile. They were proof of life and energy, proof of a home filled with movement and laughter. But that night they felt like shadows of a time that no longer existed. My ankle was throbbing with every pulse of my heart, and I could feel the heat swelling up through the skin, my head still light from the strain of moving around earlier in the day. And all I had wanted was a moment of care, a ride to a clinic that was not even 15 minutes away. But the refusal I had received carried a sharpness that went deeper than bone. I thought about the countless rides I had given him without a second thought. The times I rearranged my own plans, missed work shifts, and even walked long distances in the rain, just to make sure he arrived somewhere safe and on time. I remembered carrying him when he was too tired to walk, holding his small frame against me while the rain soaked my coat and my shoes squelched with every step, and how I would hum quietly to distract him from the cold. There had been no question then, no hesitation, no weighing of whether it was convenient for me, because that's what love looked like to me. It showed up, no matter the cost. As I sat there, the truth began to settle in like a slow, heavy fog, wrapping itself around me, making every breath feel heavier. This wasn't about a single night or a single request. This was the culmination of a slow shift that had been happening for years, one I had tried to ignore. The sharpness in his voice when I called his name, the way he sighed when I asked for help reaching something from a high shelf, the distracted nods when I spoke about my day. They had been small moments at first, easy to dismiss, but now they strung together in my mind like a chain I could not break free from. I realized that somewhere along the line, I had gone from being the center of his world to being an afterthought, from being a person he relied on to a responsibility he resented, and that cut deeper than any insult could. I glanced around the room at the familiar furniture, the curtains I had hemmed myself, the photo frames on the wall filled with smiles from birthdays and holidays past. It struck me then how still and cold everything felt, how the warmth I once associated with this house had been replaced by a brittle quiet that seemed to press against my chest. I could feel tears threatening to well up, but I forced them back, because I knew in that moment that crying wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't turn back time or make him see me differently. What I needed now was not pity, not even an apology. What I needed was clarity, and I had it. This house was no longer my safe place, and if I stayed, I would only keep shrinking into a version of myself I didn't recognize. The pain in my ankle made me wince as I shifted in my seat, and it was as if my body was confirming what my heart already knew. I couldn't keep asking for help where there was no willingness to give it. I couldn't keep pretending that I mattered to someone who could so easily dismiss me. It was then, in that still, heavy quiet, that the idea began to form. It wasn't loud or impulsive. It didn't come with anger or revenge in its first breath. It came softly, but with a firmness that filled every corner of my mind. I would leave. I didn't yet know exactly when or how, but I knew I wouldn't be sitting in that same chair months from now, waiting for kindness that never came. I would find a way to step out of this house, out of this dynamic, and into a place where I could breathe again. And as that thought rooted itself deeper inside me, I felt something shift. Not in the room, but in me. And I knew that change was no longer just an option, it was a necessity. That night, I waited until the house was quiet, the kind of silence where you can hear the ticking of the clock and the faint creak of the walls settling, and I moved slowly so the pain in my ankle wouldn't send me stumbling. I wrapped it with the softest scarf I could find, slipped a few important papers and some cash into my purse, and stood for a moment in the doorway, letting my eyes rest on the room I had called home for so many years. There was no anger in me now, only a deep, steady resolve. The air outside was cold against my face as I stepped onto the street, the light from the street lamps pooling in small circles along the sidewalk, and I made my way carefully, each step sending a dull throb through my leg. 4 blocks felt like 40, but I kept going, the sound of my own breath and the soft rustle of my purse the only company I had. When I finally reached the bus stop, I lowered myself onto the bench, feeling the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on me, but also the faintest glimmer of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom, beginning to take shape. The bus ride felt endless, the dim overhead lights flickering now and then, casting the faces of the few passengers into momentary shadow before bringing them back into view. I sat near the back, my purse clutched tightly against me, the soft hum of the engine mixing with the faint rattle of the windows each time we hit a bump. Outside, the city passed in a blur of closed shop fronts, dark houses, and the occasional glow of a diner sign still lit against the night. I kept my gaze fixed on the window, but my mind was moving faster than the bus itself, turning over every step that had led me here. I thought about how I had spent so much of my life making sure everyone else had what they needed, how I had learned to make do, to go without, to adjust my dreams to fit inside the narrow spaces left over after meeting someone else's demands. It wasn't bitterness that filled me now, but a strange, quiet awareness that if I didn't change my direction, the rest of my years would be spent waiting for moments of care that might never come. When the bus finally slowed near the address I had written on a scrap of paper, I stood carefully, feeling the stiffness in my ankle from sitting too long. The night air hit me as I stepped down, colder here, with a faint scent of damp pavement. I looked up at the small brick building ahead, the women's co-op I had heard about years ago, but never imagined I would one day need. Its entrance light was still on, casting a gentle yellow glow over the worn steps leading up to the door. My knock was soft but quick, and after a moment, the door opened to reveal a woman with kind eyes and tired lines around her mouth, the sort that come from a lifetime of listening to hard stories. She didn't ask for explanations, didn't press me for details. She simply stepped aside and let me in. The warmth inside was almost overwhelming. After the chill outside, the faint smell of coffee lingered in the air, and somewhere down the hall I could hear the low murmur of women talking quietly. The walls were painted a pale cream, the kind of color that doesn't try to impress you, it just wants you to feel safe. I filled out a short form at the desk, paid the first month in cash, and was handed a key with a small worn tag dangling from it. My room was at the end of the hall, modest and plain, but to me, it felt like the beginning of something I hadn't had in years, a space that was truly mine. I sat on the edge of the bed, running my fingers over the quilt, and felt a calm settle into me. There was a phone on the nightstand, the kind with big buttons and a steady dial tone. I picked it up and called the only person I knew I could trust with my next step, an old friend who had once helped me through a different chapter of my life. When she answered, her voice was warm with surprise, and I told her simply that I was ready to make a change. She didn't ask why, didn't ask for the details I wasn't ready to give. She just asked what I needed. And in that moment, the weight I had been carrying felt lighter, because I realized I was no longer waiting for permission to take control of my own life. The next morning, light filtered softly through the thin curtains, and for the first time in a long while, I woke without the heaviness of dread pressing on my chest. My ankles still ached, but the quiet around me was different from the silence I had left behind. It was warm, unhurried, without the tension of waiting for a sharp word or an impatient sigh. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, looking at the small key in my hand, and I thought about how something so simple could mean so much, the power to open a door that was mine alone. After a cup of tea in the shared kitchen, I picked up the phone and called my friend again, my voice steady as I told her exactly what I wanted. I gave her one name for the sale, mine, and the line went silent for a moment before she quietly said she understood. She promised to handle everything quickly and carefully, and I knew she would. Hanging up, I felt a stillness settle in my chest, not the emptiness of loss, but the quiet certainty that I had taken the first real step toward reclaiming my life. The days that followed moved slowly, but for once I didn't mind the pace, because each hour was my own, and I was no longer bracing for the sound of footsteps or the weight of someone else's moods filling the room. I spent those first mornings sitting by the small window in my room at the co-op, sipping tea and watching the street below, the steady hum of life carrying on without me having to explain where I was or what I was doing. My ankle was healing bit by bit, though I still walked carefully. And in that quiet time, I began sorting through the pieces of my life that I wanted to take with me into whatever came next. I made a list of what I would need, not just for comfort, but for independence. And I thought about the kind of space I wanted. Somewhere small, with light in the mornings and a market nearby. Somewhere I could move through my days without feeling like a shadow in someone else's home. Every evening I would call my friend to check on the progress, and each time she would tell me a little more. The papers were being drawn up, the photos taken, the listing prepared. Her voice carried a kind of quiet efficiency, the sound of someone who was both protecting me and making sure no loose ends were left behind. We agreed not to say a word to anyone until it was done, because I didn't want interference. No sudden change of heart on his part. No one showing up to make promises they wouldn't keep just to delay what was already in motion. I wasn't acting out of spite, and I reminded myself of that often. I was acting out of self-respect. And that is a very different thing. At night, when the building was quiet, I would lie in bed and think about the years I had spent in that old house. About the laughter that used to fill it, the seasons passing through its windows, the little repairs I'd done with my own hands to keep it standing. Those memories would drift in and out, and while they still carried some warmth, they no longer held me. The idea of closing that chapter no longer felt like loss. It felt like release. And with each day that passed, I could feel something in me growing lighter, as if the air around me was slowly changing. Making room for a life where my worth didn't depend on whether it was convenient for someone else to acknowledge it. The call came sooner than I expected, my friend's voice carrying a quiet satisfaction as she told me everything was ready. The sign would go up that afternoon, and the listing would be live before the sun set. I could picture it in my mind. The old house standing there with that fresh board planted in the front yard, my face on the flyer, and beneath it, the line I had chosen so carefully, "I'm not your chauffeur either." It wasn't meant to be cruel, it was meant to be honest. A reflection of the moment that had opened my eyes and pushed me to take this step. I imagined him driving by, seeing it for the first time. The surprise that would run through him when he realized I had done all of this without a word, without asking his permission, without giving him the chance to stop me. There was a strange calm in knowing that my life had shifted so completely in just a matter of weeks, and that for the first time in years, every decision I was making belonged to me alone. 2 weeks had passed since I slipped out into the night, and in all that time I had not heard his voice, not once, until the day my friend called to tell me the sign was in place. That same afternoon, my phone began to ring over and over, the number flashing again and again. But I let it go unanswered. I knew why he was calling, and I knew there was nothing he could say that would make me undo what had already been set in motion. Later, I heard from a cousin that he had been calling everyone he could think of, asking if they had seen me, even posting online that I was missing and might be confused, as if the only reason I would leave was because I had lost my way. It was almost laughable, how quickly he had turned my absence into a performance. But beneath that amusement was a quiet sadness that he still couldn't imagine I might have left, simply because I had chosen to. I pictured him pulling into the driveway, expecting to walk through that door like nothing had changed, and instead finding the for sale sign standing there like a sentry. I imagined the way he might have gotten out of the car, walked closer, read the words on the flyer, and felt that moment of recognition sink in. Perhaps he would remember the night at the kitchen table, my voice asking for a ride, his eyes fixed on his phone, his voice dismissing me as if I were asking for something unreasonable. Or perhaps he wouldn't. Perhaps he would only see the inconvenience of it all, the disruption to his plans, the house he had assumed would always be there now slipping beyond his reach. I thought about whether he would be angry or surprised, whether he would try to find me in person, and I decided it didn't matter. What mattered was that I was no longer living in a place where my needs were an afterthought, no longer waiting for moments of kindness that might never come. The weight that had once sat so heavy on my shoulders was lifting with each day, and though I knew he might come looking, I was certain of one thing: I wasn't going back. This was my life now, shaped by my own hands, and no amount of searching on his part could change that. It was a few days later when he finally managed to find me, catching sight of me at the market as I stood by a stall choosing fresh fruit. I felt his presence before I heard his voice, that sharp mix of surprise and frustration cutting through the hum of conversation around us. He stepped closer, asking why I had left without saying anything, his words rushing out as if the answer might change what had already been done. I turned to face him, calm and steady, and told him there was nothing more to explain than what he already knew, that I had asked for something simple and been met with dismissal. And that moment had shown me exactly where I stood. He tried to soften his tone to suggest that I had overreacted, but I held his gaze without anger, only certainty, and told him plainly that I had done what I needed to protect my own peace. There was a flicker in his eyes then, something between realization and disbelief, but I didn't linger to see which one would win. I paid for my fruit, thanked the vendor, and walked away without looking back, leaving him standing there in the middle of the market with all the answers he was going to get. In the weeks that followed that meeting at the market, I didn't hear from him again, and I didn't seek him out either, because there was nothing left between us that required words. My days began to fill with a different kind of rhythm, one that was gentle and steady, built on small routines that were entirely my own. I would wake to the sound of the street below, slowly coming alive, the smell of bread baking drifting in from the bakery at the corner, and I would take my time moving through the morning without anyone watching the clock over my shoulder. I started exploring the neighborhood, finding little shops where the owners greeted me by name after only a few visits, and quiet paths where I could walk without thinking about who might be waiting for me at home with another request or complaint. It was during one of these walks that I passed by the office of the lawyer I had used years ago for another matter, and something inside me told me to go in. I sat down across from him, explaining in calm, measured words that I wanted to make changes to my will. I told him exactly how I wanted my affairs handled, who I wanted to be taken care of, and which causes I wanted to support when I was gone. His pen moved steadily across the paper as I spoke, and with each detail, I felt a weight lifting, as if I was not only reclaiming my present but securing my future as well. By the time I left his office, the decisions were in motion, and I knew there would be no reversing them without my consent. I imagined, much later, that he might hear about these changes, and I wondered if it would be anger or regret that would fill him first. But I also knew it no longer mattered to me, because this life I was building was no longer tied to his approval or his gratitude. My world had shifted, and now it was shaped by people and places that valued me for who I was, not for what I could provide or how easily I could be set aside. Every evening, as I sat by the window with a cup of tea, looking out at the glow of the streetlights, I felt a kind of peace that had been missing for far too long. I had stepped away from the place that once felt like everything, and in doing so I had found something greater. The quiet, steady knowledge that I belonged wholly to myself. Looking back now, I realized that what I did wasn't running away. It was finally walking toward the life I should have been living all along. I left behind the weight of being unappreciated, of having my needs pushed aside, and I stepped into a space where I could breathe without fear of being made to feel like a burden. There are moments when I think about the old house, about the years I poured into it and the person I once was there. But those thoughts no longer sting. They simply remind me of how far I've come. I learned that protecting your peace is not selfish, it is necessary, and that the people who truly value you will never make you beg for their kindness. If you've ever reached that point where you chose yourself after being overlooked for too long, tell me in the comments, or just write, "I chose me," and stay here with me by subscribing so we can share more of these truths together.